what gave me hope was to see that while Americans are fighting for democracy, they are also including immigrants in their fights. And it gives me hope because I believe in humanity. And I believe that while it's taking time, but people will come around.
Hey there, I'm Jesse Mayshark, and this is Headlights, Voices from the Progressive South. Headlights is a production of the Progressive South, a nonprofit media platform dedicated to amplifying progressive voices and values across the southern United States. Voices like Tessa Petit, executive director of the Florida Immigrant Coalition, which fights for the legal rights and interests of her state's large immigrant population. My conversation with her is coming up, and she has great insights about how the politics of immigration have shifted in Florida, and why some immigrant families supported the election of President Donald Trump. As we've talked about here before, Florida is central to the Trump administration's mass deportation project, and most of this episode is going to be about that from a few different angles, including a drive out to the detention camp the state government is calling Alligator Alcatraz. Later in the Arts and Culture segment, we'll take a look at a new biography of an often overlooked Arkansas poet who died young. So to Florida, specifically Miami. I spent a few days there the other week. It's a really interesting and complicated city. I'll have some other conversations coming up in future episodes about history and politics, both in Miami and statewide. But one of the mornings I was there, I headed out of the city, westward on Highway 41 toward the Everglades. I was staying in a neighborhood just off of Southwest 8th Street in Miami. The street is known as Calle Ocho in the Little Havana district, where it is lined with Cuban restaurants, shops, and historical markers, including a memorial park dedicated to what it calls the martyrs of the failed 1961 Bay of Pigs invasion of Cuba. If you head west on Southwest 8th Street, it gains lanes as it leaves the city proper, heading into the sprawling exurbs of unincorporated Dade County. And then it narrows again as the development falls away, eventually turning into a two-lane blacktop, heading out into the Everglades. This is the Tamiami Trail, so named because it connects Tampa on Florida's central west coast to Miami at its southeastern corner. About one-third of its 284-mile length runs through the South Florida wilderness, skimming the northern boundary of Everglades National Park and plunging straight through the Big Cypress National Reserve. It is not the fastest way to cross the peninsula. That is Interstate 75, about 25 miles north. So the traffic on the Tamiami Trail tends to be tourists, nature lovers, and others in not too much of a hurry. The speed limit tops out at 55 miles per hour. The wetlands of the Everglades lie on both sides of the highway, which is peppered with occasional outfitters offering airboat tours of the sawgrass marshes. But I was heading out for a less scenic pursuit. I wanted to see where Alligator Alcatraz is. Florida Governor Ron DeSantis announced the creation of the temporary detention center in late June. Although it is housing federal immigration detainees, it is a state facility, built and paid for by Florida taxpayers. DeSantis says the state will be reimbursed for its estimated $450 million first-year investment by the Federal Emergency Management Agency, specifically FEMA's Shelter and Services Program for housing migrants. That fund has an annual budget of $625 million, which means that more than 70% of it will be going only to Alligator Alcatraz. The state built the camp in a hurry on a training airfield owned by Miami-Dade County. DeSantis took control of the 39-acre site using authority under a state of emergency he declared over immigration 2 years ago. It is planned to hold up to 3,000 imprisoned migrants in what are essentially large tents on an airstrip in the middle of marshes. As of mid-July, media reports said nearly 1,000 people were already detained there. Almost immediately, reports of abusive conditions at the camp started to circulate from family members of detainees, concerned members of Congress, and immigrant advocacy groups. Detainees have described brutal conditions, including icy cold air when air conditioning is working, sweltering heat when it's not, swarms of mosquitoes, terrible food, and bright fluorescent lights kept on 24 hours a day. They are forced to strip naked every time they are moved from one cell to another. One told NBC News, "It's like a dog cage." State officials have taken great glee in the name and branding of the camp as Alligator Alcatraz. It is partly a play on Alligator Alley, the nickname for the stretch of I-75 through the Everglades, and partly an invocation of the notorious San Francisco prison that Trump has proposed reopening. The Florida Republican Party is selling Alligator Alcatraz hats and T-shirts on its official website, next to the Gulf of America merchandise. The detention center is about 50 miles from Miami, and on the way the highway passes through a portion of the Miccosukee Indian Reservation. The Miccosukee are one of 3 federally recognized Seminole tribes. The U.S. military drove most Seminoles out of the state and west to Oklahoma during the Seminole Wars in the 1800s. But some took refuge in the marshes, living on tree islands that dot the landscape. On the drive, I listened to a great podcast about the Everglades called Bright Lit Place, produced by WLRN, the South Florida public radio station. I'll link it in the show notes. It recounts the history of environmental threat to the Everglades and the ways ostensible efforts to save the area's ecosystems keep falling short. As development has spread across South Florida, flood control efforts like canals and levees have led to an uneven distribution of water, with some areas being flooded, including some of the tree islands the Miccosukee had lived on, and others starved. The Everglades are distinctive for their slow-moving river of grass ecosystem, with water moving across vast sawgrass prairies. At one time they covered the southern third of the state. Their expanse is now only about half that, with much of the rest drained for development. DeSantis came into office championing Everglades restoration, and just last week he announced an agreement with the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers to accelerate those efforts. The centerpiece is a new reservoir south of Lake Okeechobee that will store and deliver billions of gallons of fresh water to the Everglades and South Florida communities. In 2023, Congress designated $447 million for the Everglades Restoration Plan. It was a record appropriation. It was also less than the $450 million it will cost to run Alligator Alcatraz for a year. Besides merchandise, Alligator Alcatraz has road signs visible from both approaches, and a big blue sign at the entrance, an otherwise nondescript side road that leads to the airfield. A police car was parked to the side, just inside the gate. I parked across the highway. The Alligator Alcatraz signs have become popular spots for selfies by Trump fans. As I was getting out of my car, I watched a middle-aged man on a Harley-Davidson motorcycle carefully position his bike in front of the sign by the entrance, and then take a series of photos of himself giving a thumbs-up sign. The only other vehicle there at the time was a maroon hatchback. Its back was open, and inside there was a young woman with a camera and cell phone, both directed at the gate. She told me she was live-streaming and taking photos of vehicles coming and going, working to build a database of the center's traffic. She had spent 2 nights there in her car and said she had seen buses arrive in the middle of the night, presumably carrying detainees. Nobody had tried to stop her from filming, but the local sheriff's department had been by to say hi a few times, letting her know they knew she was there. Alligator Alcatraz sounds like a gimmick and an authoritarian photo op, an opportunity Trump took advantage of visiting DeSantis at the site in early July. But it is also a real place, a prison camp for a projected 3,000 or more people, far from much of anything. State officials have joked that anyone who escapes will be fodder for gators and other Everglades predators. And those cruel jokes, I think, say a lot about the mindset behind the project. The Everglades are a natural wonder, as the writer and conservationist Marjorie Stoneman Douglas, their great early champion, said, "There are no other Everglades in the world." They have wide biodiversity with 300 species of fish, 360 species of birds, and 40 species of mammals, including manatees, river otters, and the endangered Florida panther. And they have been for centuries a home and refuge to people, some of whom are still there, trying to preserve their ways of life. It is a place of great complexity, beauty, and fragility. But to the people who built Alligator Alcatraz, the politicians guffawing about immigrant detainees being eaten by alligators or pythons, the bounty of this irreplaceable and vulnerable landscape is nothing more than a barrier to freedom, one more layer of razor wire. In much the same way they see Florida's vast immigrant population, which is so central to the state's economy, culture, and identity, as only a resource to be exploited in a theater of political cruelty, they see its wild waters as merely a staging area. In their eyes, the Everglades is not a refuge, but a prison. My interview guest this week, Tessa Petit, has been out to Alligator Alcatraz herself. Last week, the Florida Immigrant Coalition joined other advocacy groups in a press conference outside the entrance to the facility to protest the conditions inside. Detention conditions are unlivable, she told the assembled press. The Florida Immigrant Coalition, or FLIC, brings together more than 80 grassroots organizations from across the state to advocate for the rights and needs of its large immigrant population. There are an estimated 5 million foreign-born residents of Florida, making up about 21% of the total population. Petit is one of them. She moved to the U.S. from Haiti in 2001. She earned a degree in administration and organizational leadership from Barry University in Miami. And she has put those skills to work on behalf of immigrants and refugees for the past 11 years, first with Catholic Charities and since 2016 with FLIC. The coalition has been on the forefront of working and, when necessary, fighting on behalf of immigrants for years. It was formed in 1998 and formally incorporated in 2004. It has had to ramp up all of those efforts this year with the mass deportation program of the second Trump administration. FLIC has had some notable successes in pushing back, most prominently in challenging a new Florida law that would allow state and local law enforcement agencies to arrest and detain undocumented immigrants. Represented by the ACLU, the Immigrant Coalition joined with the Farm Worker Association of Florida and individual plaintiffs to challenge the law as a usurpation of federal authority. A federal judge issued a stay blocking the law, and the U.S. Supreme Court unanimously allowed the stay to remain in place while the case proceeds, which means the law is blocked for the time being. I met with Petit in her office in a commercial building in northern Miami. She talked eloquently about her own experience of coming to the United States and the many challenges this year in particular has brought to advocates for immigrants in the Sunshine State. So, Seth, let's go to the tape.
And Tessa Petit, thank you so much for taking the time to talk. I really appreciate it. I know things are very busy here right now.
Thank you, Jesse, for having me. I'm happy to make the time to help you make a point anywhere we can make a point about immigration and the injustices that are happening now. I'll make myself available.
I wonder if you could start with a little of your own background. Obviously, you have the experience of coming to this country as an immigrant. How have your personal experiences kind of shaped your thinking about these issues and your commitment to your work?
So I left Haiti in 2001, and because of political insecurities, political attacks, and when I came here with my family, I applied for asylum. And that's why the asylum process is so dear to me, because I probably would not still be alive if that didn't exist. And I also was able back then to experience firsthand the value of due process, because we were originally denied asylum by the immigration officer, but we were able to appeal and go in front of an immigration judge, at which point the asylum was granted. And that's because the judge realized that the lawyer we had hired had not processed our paperwork properly. So because of an error, my life would have been at stake and that of my family. And so I experienced due process firsthand, and I know how important it is And then later on in 2010, after the earthquake, I was running a homeless shelter for Catholic Charities at the time. And we had a lot of families that came in from Haiti. And as their stay in the United States was being questioned, I was able to see the relief that TPS provided to those families who would have not been able to go back to Haiti, neither for health care or even to have access to basic needs, which, again, also makes me believe in the importance and the value of temporary protective status.
So the Florida Immigrant Coalition formed in 1998. By the time you came to it, it had been in operation for almost 2 decades. Can you tell me just a little bit about what its work broadly has been over that time? I guess the central idea is to kind of bring together everybody in the state working around immigration issues and have kind of a coherent message and advocacy.
So back in 1998, when FLIC was formed, it was actually a collaboration of 7 or 8 grassroots organizations that work with immigrants, and they realized that they needed an arm that would focus on policy, because they could do all the work, but what needed to happen was policy changes. And so that was our purpose, and we've been focusing on policy work at the state level and partnering with national groups, working on policy work at the federal level and also at the very local municipal level. So we were, over the years, we were able to win in-state tuition for DACA recipients and immigrants on temporary status. We were also able to work, because a lot of our members are also in labor, we were also able to work on Fight for 15, the minimum wage. We also worked on wage protection, wage theft protection in Miami-Dade County, because there were a lot of undocumented immigrants who were being abused and their wages were being held from them. So that's what our initial focus was. And then in 2017, right at the very beginning of Trump 1.0, we started focusing on what we call community protection also, which is educating families, educating individuals, sharing with them, teaching them their rights, and helping them prepare in case of an unexpected deportation or ICE enforcement. And but we could, and that's basically what our focuses are. And then also litigation. We litigated again Miami-Dade County. We're in litigation with the state. So we use all possible tactics to make sure that there is fair treatment for immigrants in the state, but also to make sure that immigrants are informed of their rights.
So in the time that you've been at FLIC since 2016, I guess, has all of this work gotten harder? The rhetoric, I mean, of course, the United States has a long history of anti-immigrant rhetoric, and we've gone through many cycles of this in our history. We are obviously at another peak now of this kind of anti-immigration fervor coming from the federal level and in Florida, really from the state level as well. So I guess how has that shifted in the last 10 years, and how has FLIC had to adapt in response to that?
We've definitely seen a shift. What we had in 2017, we were all on the fence, and we were there for at least 4 or 5 years. But we did see the changes, right? We started seeing the changes in Florida legislature. 2023, we had to fight against one of the most horrible anti-immigrant bills in the United States. We were able to water it down, but not get rid of it completely. And we're seeing more intentional attacks on immigrants. So we've done more advocacy work at the state legislature. We've had to increase our presence there. This year, we had full-time staff during the entire time of the legislature. And we also realized that it's gotten harder. Immigration has historically been a bipartisan issue, but we realized that years ago it became a dividing issue, and it was, if you're Republican, you're anti-immigrant, and if you're Democrat, well, maybe you're pro-immigrant, right? But we have historically fought in a bipartisan way. We've had champions on both sides of the aisle through the years, but that also changed, right? And then, I mean, when it comes to community protection, we've had to definitely triple our capacity to protect our communities. We've had to become much more creative, and but also it's more demanding. It's like there's multiple fights at the same time. You're fighting policy, you're fighting what I would, at this point, for example, Alligator Alcatraz, I call it a human rights violation situation, and the lawlessness that currently exists. So the fights have accumulated. They're very different. The 287G agreements, which deputizes law enforcement, Florida actually has over 40% of the total number of 287Gs nationwide. And like you said, it's odd for a state like Florida to show such hatred toward immigrants. And so the fight doesn't stop. And what we're fighting now, for example, at the 287G level is threats. I call them threats to democracy, because elected officials being threatened to be taken out of office if they don't implement an agreement that is not required by law for other than counties. To me, that's a threat to democracy, and that is setting up precedents. And so sometimes I ask myself, am I fighting for immigrants or am I fighting for democracy in the United States? That's how much the fight has changed.
Right. And there's certainly a lot of ways in which it seems like what we're seeing is immigration being used as, on one hand, kind of an end to itself, but also as a way to attack civil society more broadly, and to try to limit the rights of local officials to stand up, and local organizations and communities to stand up.
Correct.
So I'm wondering, this year it's been such a flood, obviously, since the new administration took office. And I know that in Florida, it seems like kind of all of the resources of state government, essentially, not just law enforcement, but multiple different state agencies have also been put at the disposal of the federal authorities. So how are you all and your partner organizations keeping up with all of this, both on a logistical and resource side, but also, the kind of psychological and emotional toll that this must take on everybody, because you kind of hear one horrible story after another?
So I'll start with the psychological side. As FLIC, as an organization, we've had to do some trauma-informed training to protect our staff against vicarious trauma. We are a staff of 26. We have folks from 16 different countries amongst our 26 people, and a lot of us are immigrants, and we're impacted, either family, some of us are in, temporary status. So we've had to do that. We've had to create healing spaces, also what we call healing spaces for our membership, creating spaces where people feel that it is safe enough to be vulnerable, to even cry about what they're experiencing, right? Because we try to be tough, because we know we're doing the work, and we think we have to be strong, but being vulnerable is also a form of strength, right? So we're helping create those spaces. And on the resource-wise, they're attacking organizations that are doing the advocacy work and the community protection work, but they are also attacking foundations. So the resources that we used to have to protect our communities. Oh, because of how work has ramped up, the foundations have not met the demand of what is happening in the field, right? And I guess everyone is also that, everyone is in self-preservation mode. So unfortunately, that's where we are. But I have to say that, and I'm very grateful that it's also people who never stepped up before are stepping up now, and seeing that non-immigrants are stepping up and expressing their support to immigrant communities, are volunteering. That is not only that is very helpful, but it is also heartwarming, because when you're the kid that is bullied, when you see someone come to protect you, it makes you feel it's helpful, because it reminds you that you're actually worth something, and you have people by your side who are going to help you stop the bully. And so we need financial support, but we also, I think mostly at this point in time, we need people to say, I want to stand up and I want to be that protector for your community, for you who are voiceless, who cannot risk to speak right now. We're willing to lend our voice to your struggles, right? So
thinking, you mentioned Florida being a state with so many immigrants. We're here in Miami, where I think about 55% of the population of Miami is not born in the United States. And yet we saw in this past election, obviously, Donald Trump won Florida by a considerable amount and even performed very well in Miami-Dade County, which means that there are a lot of, first, second, third generation immigrant families who voted for a platform that very explicitly called for mass deportation. I'm sure that you all talk about this among yourselves. What are your thoughts about what kind of drives that? Are people voting sort of despite that? Were people not taking it seriously? Or is there support in some immigrant communities for some of this?
So what we understood from speaking to communities and also other partners who did a lot of listening sessions in our communities, what we understood was that the Trump campaign's messaging worked. They convince even immigrants that there was an invasion. They even convinced immigrants that had been here for a while but could not regularize their status that all this flow of new arrivals was to their detriment. So they really divided the community. And then the worst thing was, even for folks who had friends and family members, and even for folks who were undocumented themselves, they believed that the mass deportation was only going to impact criminals. And so they believed that their family, because they believed the rhetoric about the good immigrant and the bad immigrant. And so that what drove a lot to vote that way. And even now, as we're talking to our member organizations that are really the grassroots organization, we're hearing them say in some communities, they still say, yes, it's too much, but there's still, because it was ingrained in them so much that this was about bad immigrants, and that this new flow of immigrants was taking away this scarcity mind. They also won in setting a scarcity mindset that made Americans believe that immigrants were getting SNAP and Medicaid. Newsflash, out of the 2 million Americans who are losing Medicaid with the big, beautiful bill, just in the state of Florida, only 180,000 of them were immigrants, and that's because those were refugees, and there was a particular specific program for refugees. And part of them were refugees, the other part were because the parents were immigrants, but the children were U.S. citizens. So, of course, the benefits went to the parents, but for the children. And so this scarcity mindset, if you can put $170 billion towards immigration, but then take away Medicaid and deprive communities of their basic needs, my thing is, I'm wondering who is prompting Americans to ask themselves the question, where is the lie?
So you had success this year with a lawsuit against, I think it's Senate Bill 4C. Can you talk just a little bit about that, the significance of what that state law is trying to do, and then the fact that you have been able to get a stay that was upheld by the Supreme Court? Obviously, the case still has to work its way through the system, but can you just talk about that case a little bit?
Yes. So the similar law came out in 2023. It was part of SB 1718, but that made it a felony to bring someone into the state. One of our members, the Farm Workers Association of Florida, who is also co-plaintiffs with us on this lawsuit, they won on the premise that states that immigration law is a federal issue, not a state issue. And so when they finalized SB 4C, we decided to file the lawsuit for two reasons. Is because we also saw that some counties, some municipalities had decided to become overzealous and copy the state law. So it passed, for example, in Jacksonville, right? They had two ordinances. One of them established the same law. And
that basically their local police department could literally charge people with a crime for being undocumented,
for having entered illegally into the United States and then entering Jacksonville. Like, doesn't make sense. But that was that. And then any abuse against immigrants is something that we have to address. So we were able to do that. And I actually got a news article right before coming to speak to you on, because you know that the Attorney General is on contempt of court, and the contempt of court requires that they submit a biweekly report. And in their biweekly report, they did confirm that there were 2 arrests made at the end of May under the SB 4C. So confirming that law enforcement has been in contempt of court in the state. And what not only being able to stop something unlawful is one thing, being able to stop this principle that states can now pass immigration-related policies, right, which is a federal privilege, is another thing. And then, but lastly is this just shows that there are intentional disregard for the judicial branch that is happening. We're not just seeing it here in Florida, it is happening in other places. And if we can protect the validity of the judicial system, which is basically the only leg we're standing on right now, then it's just as important.
So the last thing I wanted to ask you about, from kind of looking at the big picture in terms of places that you see hope, because obviously right now I'm sure everything is very fraught. I'm sure you saw the recent survey that came out that showed across the U.S. population support for immigrants and for immigration has actually gone up this year somewhat significantly, which is presumably somewhat in response to the things people are seeing that they don't like. Does that give you hope? What are you hearing as you engage in kind of this ongoing fight that makes you think that, things can turn around this trajectory?
So I've been to a couple of mobilizations that have been organized throughout the state. And what amazed me was that while Americans are fighting, and, the participants were overwhelmingly white, right? What gave me hope was to see that while Americans are fighting for democracy, they are also including immigrants in their fights. And it gives me hope because I believe in humanity. And I believe that while it's taking time, but people will come around. On last Tuesday, I was at the commission hearing in Key West, and I was able to listen to almost 100 testimonies of folks who are not immigrants at all, and to come and stand up to protect an immigrant community, their immigrant communities. And that gave me hope, seeing that people are connecting and people are making the connection that at the end of the day, immigrants are human beings and are worth it. That gives me hope, because I know we can't fight this fight on our own. We can't fight for immigrants only with immigrants. Also seeing the shift coming from a dictatorship, and I quickly saw the writing on the wall, and seeing America wake up to fight this authoritarianism that they're trying to establish in the country, that also gives me hope, because I hope that in the fight for democracy, we will go back to rule of law. We will go back into laws that are fair and just to everyone, including immigrants.
All right. Well, I guess that's a good place to end it. So, Tessa Petit, thank you so much. I really appreciate it.
Thank you, Jesse.
And now our arts and culture segment. Just a note, this report makes reference to suicide. Arkansas poet Frank Stanford was not by any account an easy person. Beset with mental illness from a young age, perennially in and out of marriages and relationships, he published several books of poems before taking his own life in 1978 at the age of 29. He was born in Mississippi and spent much of his childhood in Memphis, but his mother and stepfather then moved to Arkansas, where Stanford went to high school. He attended the University of Arkansas in Fayetteville, although he did not earn a degree there. What he did was write in great volume and in an interesting and unstable voice that could veer between Southern dialect and modernist minimalism. His most famous work is The Battlefield Where the Moon Says I Love You, a poem with 15,283 lines covering 542 pages, all without any stanza breaks or punctuation. Here, to take a much smaller example, is his poem Flies on Shit. To the gentlemen from the South, to the tourists from the North who write poems about the South, to the dumbass students, I'd like to ask one lousy question. Have you ever seen a regatta of flies sail around a pile of shit and then come back and picnic on the shit? Just once in your life have you heard flies on shit? Because I cut my eye teeth on flies floating in shit. More than 40 years after his death, Stanford is now the subject of a long biography called The Life and Poetry of Frank Stanford, written by James McWilliams, a history professor at Texas State University, and published by the University of Arkansas Press. The publisher's description of the book asserts Stanford's place in the pantheon of modern poets, and especially modern Southern poets. It says, quote, "The themes that preoccupied Stanford's prolific output, Language, sex, death, class, geography, commercialism, surrealism, film, race also preoccupied the poet in his daily life, which was marked by heavy drinking, philandering, mental instability, emotional abuse, and through it all, an inveterate desire for beauty. Even if you're not up for a 686-page biography, its publication is a good time to get acquainted or reacquainted with Stanford's own writing. I'll put a link to some of his poems in the show notes. You can also find online a short experimental 1974 film called It Wasn't a Dream, It Was a Flood, a quasi-autobiographical work directed by Stanford and his publisher, Irv Broughton. It includes some narration by Stanford, including these thoughts about the South.
Well, in the South, things are all just interrelated like this. You can't quit. When a man shoots somebody over here, or when this man marries this woman, or when someone has an affair here, it's everybody, it's all going to have to take its toll from high and low.
And that wraps us up for this week. Remember, the Progressive South is a nonprofit media outlet, and you can find information about contributing to our efforts on our website, theprogressivesouth.org. If you do feel moved to make a donation, first of all, thank you. And second, make sure you make a note in the comments accompanying it that it is for the Progressive South. Thanks to Bark for our theme music, and to Lord Seth the Libertarian for his production work at Barbarian Productions. And thanks to you for listening. Remember, you can call and say hey from wherever you are. Just leave us a message at 865-214-7764. That's 865-214-PROG. Tell us your first name, where you're calling from, and take up to a minute to let us know what's going on where you are. We'll talk to you soon.